finishing his dissertation work this semester and will graduate. And I'm going to just break some news. Nate is on the short list of 2 prominent institutions. So I'm really proud of him for not only his work, but his determination in getting his name out there amid COVID and having to travel in COVID and putting his best foot out there and just drawing the attention of so many wonderful opportunities. I'm just so proud of him. You know, you go through the dark days of the dissertation and there is light at the end of the tunnel, and then opportunities come. So I'm super proud of him. In addition to that, Nate is going to be the speaker at the EHE graduation event. So I hope that if you're able to come to that, that you enjoy him there as well. Nate, if you're ready to get started, I'm going to turn the floor back over to you. It looks like we are we're ready here. Do you have everything you need? Okay. Nate,
1 second to share my screen, yes.
Okay. Nate is an educational policy student here at The Ohio State University. His talk today is going to be on Black educational resistance and justice research, centering Afrocentric visions in critical educational policy studies. Nate came to me by way of introduction through Yvonne Goddard, and I see she's in the room also. Yvonne, how are you? It's good to see you. And we have just had a wonderful exploration with Nate in the journey that his interests have taken us. So Nate, if you're ready, I am ready to give it over to you.
All right, can everyone see my screen? Okay.
Yes.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Beard, so much. It's so nice to be in community with you all to share a little bit about our work, not just my work, centering Black educational resistance and educational justice. So for me, it is Black History Month, but every day is Black History Month, which means that I cannot speak in individualistic terms when describing my role in our collective work. I am the product of millions of Black Americans, Afro-Indigenous people, Pan-Africanists, Jamaicans, my colleagues and co-researchers. So it's really with their resolve and energy that places me in front of you today. So, and that's every day. So thank you all for being with me, and I'm excited to share a little bit about this work. So I plan to just give you an overview real quick about what I'm going to talk about today. And first, I'm going to situate my role within our collective work and talk about why it's so important, give some examples of what that looks like. And then finally, I am going to end with an invitation and reflection that I'll ask everybody to participate in with me. But before I get started, I want to share a little bit about me. Some of you know me very well. Others are new to hearing my story. So a little bit about me. My intellectual awakening was when I attended Berea College and studied Africana Studies. It was here where I was taught the history of my African ancestors from people who looked like me. Unfortunately, my K-12 curriculum, there was no mention of my heritage rooted in the Maroons of Jamaica, who were self-liberated Africans fighting colonialism in the Caribbean. There was no mention of Marcus Garvey, Jamaican philosopher of Pan-Africanism. And so the experience that I had through connecting to Afrocentric intellectual thought led me to the teaching profession. Because I wanted to be the educator that I did not have growing up. I wanted to give or provide students the education that I did not have. So in the classroom, I delivered general science curriculum rooted in the scientific advancements and contributions of my students and I's African ancestors. And it was really what I love to do, and I still love to teach. So I quickly realized, though, that oppressive educational policy structures suppress the influence that my students and I had on the educational politics that dictated our lives. And so after contemplating a couple different paths, I was thinking about, school leadership and some other outside of the classroom opportunities. I ultimately decided to pursue a degree in educational policy with the focus and intention of supporting Black justice-oriented school leaders and educators as we partnered together to produce knowledge capable of dismantling and abolishing these oppressive educational policy structures. So this is the story that led me to Ohio State. It puts me in front of you today and also situates me in our work. So our work, I conceptualize it as Black educational resistance or educational justice research. And I know that's a mouthful, so I want to kind of just situate and offer a little more explicit positioning on what that means. So here is a helpful diagram that I often forward to kind of show you the path that gets me to the specific focus, with the macro to micro process here, with the broadest being critical educational policy studies, to then focusing on the educational policy of the oppressed, or how I define the collective actions of Black educators, school leaders, and their co-conspirators in their efforts to build new educational policy structures. So let's start with critical educational policy studies and then move to my most specific focus. So critical educational policy studies has started to gain steam recently, but I want to be clear, critical scholarship on educational politics is not new. Black and brown folks have theorized about teaching and learning relating to policy structures for centuries. But what is new is kind of naming some common themes across the collective work and having some common language to push back against traditional ways of understanding educational policy. So in the table here, I kind of break down some central components to policy and then offer kind of the differences between what the field says is traditional versus critical. And I break it into policy actors, you can see processes, aims, and then finally solutions. This is by no means a comprehensive list of the components, but some of the main ones are the most popular ones that folks focus on. And so as you can see, if you go through the table here, in the traditional line of educational policy research, actors are mostly constructed and focused as the folks who have been given the most power or intentionally designed to have the most power. And so think US congressional reps, school board members, superintendents and school leaders to some extent. But in critical educational policy studies, policy actors really move to include those who've been placed at the margins. And what we do is we examine and bolster their efforts to collectively work to capture power with knowledge creation. So think families, students, teachers, laborers, etc. So when it comes to processes in the traditional frame, oftentimes traditional studies treat processes as fixed and unchangeable. I'm sure many of you have heard the argument, you can demand change all you want, but it happens slowly, as if it's just a natural process that has been, just happened to take place. And this frame really holds no analysis into the oppressive origins of the incremental nature of US political systems, right? And almost intentional design to give racist white men power to really stop any type of progress. And then you switch to aims, traditional, uphold some of these hegemonic and traditional norms, but critical educational policy studies really seeks to imagine boldly beyond the patriarchal, settler colonial, anti-Black world system. So, and then finally, solutions are very different when you frame versus, critical versus traditional, where solutions are technical, meaning that they're absent any analysis of power and privilege. And then in critical educational policy studies, justice-oriented analyses of power and privilege are at the forefront, right? How is power isolated? And then solutions mean massive redistribution of power. So those are the kind of different ways that folks will differentiate between the two frames in educational politics. But my specific line really looks at the actors, right? I'm interested in the folks who are placed at the margins within movement spaces to try to capture and obtain enough power to transform systems. So that brings me to the next kind of pillar in this conceptualization, which has to do with educational justice movements. So critical policy scholars explain that educators and those who are placed at lower tiers of the policy actor hierarchy are more than just enactors of policy, right? We're more than just observers sitting on the sideline watching policy be done to us. More contextual understandings illuminate that organized lower level actors can obtain political power through organizing collective efforts. So this makes us essential policy actors, and there's many examples of this. So educators advocating for students, what is a teacher collective in Northern California that is resisting and renegotiating policies of standardization. So they wrote blogs, used contract negotiations to reduce testing requirements. This is a collective effort of educators. Coley and company analyzed work of the People's Education Movement, New York Collective of Radical Educators, Institute of Teachers of Color, Committed to Racial Justice. Each of these groups forward social, racial, and economic justice aims, has an agenda to transform the massive wealth inequality and anti-Black racism in society. And finally, another example is in Philadelphia, the Caucus, which is a teacher activist founded group that started after the Philadelphia School District superintendent initiated plans to close 24 schools. And these folks were not playing around. They hosted numerous fundraisers, house parties to raise funds, brought in their membership, ran t-shirt campaigns, interviewed folks on local media outlets, mass flyer distribution, ran for office even in local elections. All these efforts were in an attempt to protect and sustain the neighborhoods, communal neighborhoods that were threatened by socially constructed, powerful policy actors' efforts to close them. So as we see, when we focus on a more complex analysis of power and privilege and of who are actors in educational policy, we see that there is plenty of organized students, families, teachers, youth, laborers that are participating, but are often rendered or excluded from processes, not only in educational policy research, but in the actual decision-making space. So the educational justice movement is positioned to counter these exclusive efforts and to deepen democracy and participation in ensuring that Black and Brown communities and families obtain the self-determination to decide, make decisions for their lives, and especially in the politics that impact their lives. So that brings me to my next line of research, which is Black educational resistance. So there is a thriving and robust, modern Black-led educational justice movement. So organizations like Black Lives Matter in schools, there's organized fights against punitive school discipline, fights against police presence in schools, resource disparities, fights for increased representation in the classroom and decision-making spaces. So one of the seminal articles that I have forwarded has to do with this Black educational resistance concept, which again is not something that I created, it's something that was passed to me from my ancestors. And what I conceptualize and borrow is it's teaching and learning, or the process of disseminating, sharing, and receiving knowledge. And what happens is Black educational resistance is a major medium that continues to connect us with the complex and dynamic histories of our ancestors. So, you know, lots of folks have argued about the power of historical fluency or knowing one's history. Maya Angelou, James Baldwin, the late Bell Hooks, Carnegie Woodson. And all of this is obtained through teaching and learning, right? A collective process of teaching and learning. But it's our modern work that takes this historicism even further. So what I argue in this article is that a continued reconnection with the long history of our ancestors' resistance to settler colonialism, anti-Blackness is essential for liberation. So through this, I center intergenerational exchanges that began in antiquity on the motherland, across oceans, and then eventually forced on Native American land. And so some examples of this during the 1960s, and there's lots of examples, but we only have so much time, so I'll give a couple relatively more recent ones. So in the 1860s, Black educators and educational stakeholders organized their communities, built freed people's schools, traveled long distance in community, and offered security services to ensure that they were equipped with the knowledges and skills to resist white supremacy. 100 years later, in the 1960s, one of the central components of the Black Panther Party was the dissemination of liberational knowledge through educational pursuits. And now I'm imagining 100 years from then, so 2060s, let's continue to connect with our ancestors' work and imagine how Black-led educational justice movements can build power through educational resistance and save our planet from climate inaction, its intersections with racism and anti-Blackness. So as we partake in this dreaming process of imagining further, we connect back to move forward in different ways, in new ways. And that's what the power of Black educational resistance is, rooted in this legacy of we've always been teachers and learners. So how does this impact the kind of most specific focus? And this is kind of where my work is heading. So I won't spend too much time on this, but I wanted to quickly just kind of show the ways in which educators may engage in these types of actions. And what I'm interested in is, how do folks engage in political activism? So think of protests, mutual aid efforts, you know, think of anything that takes place at the school building and beyond to demand and organize for transformation on a structural level. Then also simultaneously, because educators are positioned to facilitate critical consciousness in students, justice-oriented educators often also participate in raising consciousness of students and connecting students with their capacities to engage in the same ways that they do politically. So what I'm interested in is this intersection between the two, which is what my dissertation was focused on. And I'm really excited to share that at the end, well, in a month, I guess. So, but that's where my work resides. So again, from the broadened critical educational policy studies all the way down to educational policy of the oppressed. So this is very theoretical, right? We talked a lot about the positioning of the field. Now it's time to talk a little bit about what are some specific examples of this. Before I do that though, I wanna make some important points about my epistemological underpinnings here. So my work is not, or our work is not accountable to traditional Western epistemologies. Instead, we are accountable to each other, our communities, and equitable aims. So what does that mean, right? That means that we focus on knowledge's deep relationship to context, the importance of relationships, connections to ancestral knowledge, and then knowledge's collective ownership. So in the next slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about quantification-based studies rooted in critical race epistemologies. But I want to be clear that this is not to tap some research hierarchy, mythical research hierarchy that values one particular knowledge creation process over the other, especially in urban education, when folks focus on these random control trials that are completed in districts that are usually wealthy, white, that have very different social context than Black and brown, lower income schools and districts. So I really, with all due respect, do not care how many random control trials are conducted if it's completely absent context, right? Because it doesn't capture the nuanced lived experiences of Black, brown, and Indigenous communities. So that's why I argue that accountability must come from, or our accountability should be to Black, brown, and Indigenous-led educational justice movements. And then when we make our knowledge accountable to those spaces, we can imagine collective action, share the impact of our perceived failure, design equitable and contextual policy solutions, and also transcend static local, state, and national boundaries that are often placed between us. So let's look at some examples of what this looks like. So the first thing I'm going to share with you is something that I did in one of our classes, and I forget which actually class, one of the stats classes I took. And we ran a logistic regression, but we ran a logistic regression focused on structural or illuminating structural anti-Blackness. So how do we do that? So a lot of you have heard this societal frame of high school dropout, and lots of Black scholars, Black women in particular, have written about this. Most recently, Dr. Monique Morris, in her book on Push Out, the Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools, really provides a comprehensive analysis of the ways anti-Blackness operates in the education system. And one of her major points is that Black girls are not dropouts. It's not our individual, it's not the individual or familial level factors that lead to disengagement from school. The disengagement from school stems from systemic anti-Blackness, and it manifests from exclusion, over surveillance, punitive accountability, and white supremacy. So what happens is, instead of what Dr. Morris says, instead of framing this educational policy problem as individualized student problem, she helps us understand that there are some modern schooling structures that are pushing Black girls out of schools. So to bolster this with some quantification, again, just to ensure that we realize there's lots of ways of demonstrating how systems continue to disadvantage Black students, we wanted to run a logistic regression. And what we did is we looked at a data set that has been used ubiquitously in the field to study dropout, put that in quotation marks. So we looked at the ELS educational longitudinal study from 2002 that has been used frequently to study dropout. There's around 15,000 students, and we conducted a multiple logistic regression with two questions. First, we pulled a racial tension variable, which is system level variable, and asked, does that significantly predict push out? And then secondly, we looked at racial identity and push out as well. So we did find that racial tension was a significant predictor of all students' decisions to leave school. And we left all students in the model because we wanted to attempt, it was a strategic move to advocate to policy makers and policy actors that this is an issue generally, right? Yes, specifically for Black students is an issue, but racial tension for any students is bad relating to push out. But then to kind of focus on anti-Blackness and ensure that Black students were the focus of the regression, we made Black students the reference group, because oftentimes in these regression or in these logistic regression models, white students are made the reference group. And so what we found is that if a student in this survey identified as non-Black, they were 31% less likely to be pushed out of schools when controlling for all the things in the title. So this just reaffirms what Black educators, Black school leaders have been saying for a long time, since we had access to public education. But this quantification is not enough. We also need the anecdotal, storied, deeply complex experiences of how this manifests. So a teacher in Illinois recently repeatedly referred to 2 Black students as the N-word, even after they asked him not to. In Florida, school officials ordered a young Black girl to either straighten or cut off her natural curly hair or face expulsion. In New York, a school principal described Black students as gorillas and then projected his insecurities on our beautiful African features. So these stories, are not just 3 stories of an infinite, complex anti-Black system that continues to happen. So instead of us framing the dropout problem as a high school dropout frame, we should no longer use it. Instead, we should ask, why would we choose to subject ourselves to anti-Black education systems by staying in the schools that were not made for us? And this frame shifts the solutions to make sure that we are imagining solutions that are actually going to impact and negate and dismantle the anti-Black system. So I think, the implications here are major, they continue to be major, but again, we have to avoid these frames that continually perpetuate anti-Blackness in our schools. Another study guided by critical quantification. It's a latent path model. And so bear with me here because there's a couple of variables that I need to explain. But basically what I asked was, is it enough to just collaborate and then lead to stronger beliefs in a teacher's ability to connect with students' critical consciousness? Or what does a stronger sense of teacher solidarity do to that relationship? So we did a mediation model here where teacher solidarity is the mediator that is going to analyze, that kind of tell us something about the relationship between collaboration and then critical pedagogical efficacy, or again, a teacher's belief in themselves to foster students' sense of critical consciousness. So what we found here, we found that there was a significant impact. So 2 teachers who differ by 1 standard deviation on collaboration are estimated to differ by 0.123 standard deviations, or about 12.5%, which is a moderate effect, meaning that if a teacher has a higher sense of collective beliefs in their ability to tackle racial justice, then or racial injustice, then they're going to yield improvement or some higher sense of belief in themselves to turn towards their students and facilitate critical consciousness on the student level as well. So these variables have major implications. One, it shows that we can use more critically situated variables and move away from just traditional measures of achievement in our models. We could also analyze teacher solidarity and belonging and its implications for Black and brown educator retention. We can also look at activist beliefs and feelings of belonging as well. And the potential relationships that these variables open up are boundless. But also it means that school leaders, policymakers can bolster students' critical consciousness by promoting solidarity building on the teacher level as well. And again, that relates back to this kind of political and pedagogical activism that I mentioned earlier, where my work is heading, where we can really look at some of these variables and figure out, well, if teachers feel connected to each other in tackling and collaborating to address racial injustice in their schools, then what does that mean for students, right? Does that bolster their efforts and their advocacy capacities as well? So lots of implications there. And then finally, there's also evaluation work that can be had. I was recently employed and brought on as a survey consultant with Mosaic Education Network, and we looked at some of their workshops. And the director wanted me to kind of see if we could pull some items together to look at intersectionality, because that's something that she talks about a lot, particularly the intersection between gender and race, originally theorized by Kimberly Crenshaw's legal analysis, highlighting Black women's dual oppression from their social identities as women and Black people. So what's interesting about this is it's more evaluation based, but it is, we did a pre-post design, gave this survey. I think there's some actually more, but I can only fit 8 items on the slide. But if you take a look at these items, they really are trying to capture a person's belief and understanding of how folks experience dual oppression. After capturing what the workshop can do, then, it just provides evidence that would need to be deeply contextualized with continuous conversations, but it gives a starting point for an organization to really say, this is where we're at with intersectionality. This is what Black women in our organization are saying in interviews and in our conversations. What solutions do we need with this complete, comprehensive data to draw conclusions that are going to improve the workplace or school or institution, whatever it is. So as you can see, my specific vein of scholarship is heavily quantified. And one of the reasons is I always share is, I believe that I was past the gift of pattern identification, and it's one of the ways I feel comfortable sharing stories, and that comes from my African ancestry. Oftentimes contributions to mathematics are rooted in Western ideologies, but it's completely absent of talking about the Moors of North Africa or all the work that was done in ancient Egypt when it comes to mathematics. And so I think that it's important to acknowledge, like I said in the beginning, that this is not a preference or a hierarchy. It's just how I tell stories. And I think that methodological flexibility is crucial when it comes to educational justice. And it's also, when it comes to quantitative debt, recently, James, who was a OSU alum, who's now at North Texas, and I are actually just submitted a piece that talked about the quantitative debt owed to African diasporans. And this stems from ideas of Pan-Africanism and an unapologetic love of nuanced Blackness, which we just kind of conceptualize as there's a common struggle against global white supremacy and anti-Blackness, but at the same time, it's really our nuanced Blackness that is the true beauty, right? There's, I think, in the let me just say this. There are millions of Black folks across the diaspora, which means that there are millions of ways to be Black. And so I think that's an important piece in this, but also there's a common struggle there. And in this piece, we actually talk about the DRC and the Congolese and how their labor is exploited for some of the tools that we use as quantitative researchers. So we kind of frame the quantitative debt within the Congolese labor and resources that are exploited. And the particular resource is cobalt, which is an essential component in lithium batteries, which Apple, Google, Dell, Tesla, all of them use every year, despite terrible working conditions, inadequate compensation. So we frame it as a debt owed, and how do quantitative researchers pay the debt? There's lots of different ways, massive wealth redistribution, but also research to prioritize Afro-Indigenous laborers that illuminates the mechanisms of neocolonialism in that space. So that's another reason, just to kind of offer why I, even though I am a quantitative researcher, I think understanding the folks whose labor has led me to be able to even engage in this type of work is important. And we all should turn towards making sure we acknowledge the folks whose labor made it possible for us to even co-produce knowledge in this way. So this line of educational justice work is has lots of implications. I'm not going to read these to you, but I want you to think about what these mean, how it's shifting maybe paradigms that you participate in, or maybe it's not shifting, but it's different from paradigms that you claim. But also think about, like, as school leaders, as colleagues, as educators, scholars, you know, what does this mean in partnership, right? What does a critical educational praxis look like in all of our different roles, kind of merging together? And so this leads me to the kind of final reflection that is deeply rooted in my positionality. So Dr. Tuck, someone who I admire and read a lot of, in one of her seminal articles about participatory policy analyses, talks about a demand for schools of education to end the complicity with anti-Blackness, with settler colonialism, and really join the front lines in the movement for educational justice. And you know, I couldn't agree more to this sentiment. And as I continue into the field, this will be something that I'm continuing to collectively imagine, is what does moving a college of education to the front lines in the fight for justice and equity mean? Now, I will say though, you know, I'm no longer in the classroom. I'm no longer a school leader. So you know, I think especially this Black History Month, I'm reflecting on like my role as a scholar now. And I think my own reflection relates to the scholarly aims aligned with my practitioner first roots. I think back to when I was in the classroom, and I see my role, and just to be vulnerable with you all, I see my role as bolstering research for educational justice in partnerships with Black school leaders and other policy actors. And I want to envision a space where we can ask justice-oriented questions that may get folks in trouble sometimes because of real policy barriers. But, you know, I'm going to get paid to think unapologetically within the Black radical tradition, right? And focus on the policy of the oppressed. So let me take the burden and collect the resources, because that's what I'm paid to do. And then, you know, even though I'm no longer a practitioner on the front lines, you know, you'll be sure to see me in every decision-making space, leveraging any power I have to disrupt oppression so that our collective work can continue. So that's kind of how I've thought about my role. And I think it's, you know, this can practically happen through designing curriculum, conducting evaluation studies of justice initiatives, asking research questions that center on Black imaginaries, being flexible with methods, and then also holding ourselves accountable to each other and our communities, and not any capitalistic Western frame. And this is my hope, and something that I continue to build. So I want to give space to think together and invite you to join me in a little exercise that I frequently engage in. In my scholarship and my personal life, I often connect with my African ancestors by thinking about what they would have thought of our collective work. So join me in thinking about all the decisions that were made or acts that were taken to put us in community together today. It can get almost overwhelming, right? And, you know, in reconnecting with them, their sacrifice, courage, and love, that's really all the motivation I need to continue to contribute in this movement and continue this legacy. So with that, I invite you to continue to imagine what this work can look like. And even if we don't get to speak, in this questioning portion, I really am encouraged by how we may have been connected today. So thank you, and I appreciate the time you gave today.
Well, thank you so very much, Nate. If you would mind unplugging and giving him a round of applause, Nate, we really appreciate you taking the time to come out. I know for sure, you have a million things going on. He really is still finishing up some work and getting ready to part, and also making some life decisions. So there's just a lot going on, Nate. I really appreciate you being willing and wanting to share who you are and how you envision yourself in this academic space. I'm so, again, I'm proud because he's mine, but I'm just proud because he represents who he is. Nate is unapologetic when he walks into a room. He's unapologetic about his research. He's unapologetic about his love. And that's what draws me so fondly to him. And I will have stood on mountaintops to shout out his praise. I'm very proud of you. I want you to keep going just this way. Let your life unfold in front of you, Nate, just as you are, trying to make sense of it and doing what you said that I think is so key, which is pattern identification, focusing on the ways that life brings things to you and the patterns that they create. I'd like to open up now, though. We have some time. So if there's anyone in the audience who would like to ask